45-minute presentation. Yeah, that's all we could afford. And there will be a 15-minute question and answer session afterwards. So that's all housekeeping. And now to introduce our speaker, it's a real great pleasure to introduce my colleague and, let's say, friend, Dr. Laura Revell. Laura is an associate professor here at the University in Environmental Physics. And so Laura got her PhD here from Canterbury in 2012, and she went to Switzerland to do some postdoctoral work, to work on the chemistry climate model initiative. And basically, the results of that work form our present-day understanding how the ozone layer will evolve through the 21st century. Laura's career can only be described as stellar. She was appointed 2 years ago as a senior lecturer, and within 2 years, she became an associate professor. She's one of our youngest associate professors in the university. She's won a number of awards. She's won the University of Canterbury Early and Emerging Career Researcher Award. She was also given the Copper Award, the Royal Society of New Zealand's Early Career Research Excellence Award for Technology, Applied Science, and Engineering. So there's one in the whole country, and Laura got it. So we're very proud of her. And she is a lead author in a research publication talking about radiative effects of airborne microplastics, which was published in Nature, which is one of the top journals in the world in 2021. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Laura. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rudy, and tēnā koutou katoa. E te mana whenua ngai tuahuriri, tēnā koutou, ko Laura Revell aho. So thank you so much all for coming along this evening. It's great to see so many people here. I will be, as Rudy said, going through some recent studies on airborne microplastics and how they interact with climate change. So before I dive into things, I just wanted to go through a few definitions so we're all clear what we're talking about. So when I say microplastic, we're talking about tiny particles, smaller than 5 millimeters. Anything that is as big as 5 millimeters, you might have noticed, is technically not a micro anything, it's a milli-something, but this definition comes from the pre-production pellets that are used to produce larger plastics, so they're milled to be up to 5 millimeters big. We will also talk a little bit about nanoplastics, which are even smaller, so smaller than 1 micrometer. And out in the environment, we see fragments of plastic, fibers that are typically shed from clothing, occasionally films, beads, so microbeads that used to be in personal cleaning products and were recently banned. And so these have various sources. So basically any plastic that's out there in the environment can become brittle as it's exposed to sunlight, and it'll eventually break down to form microplastics. So when we're talking about microplastics, it's really a diverse class of pollutants. So there's lots of different compositions of plastic. They've got different colors, they've got different shapes. They're carrying different things around in the environment, which is really quite a problem, but they don't all behave in one way. So that's something that's worth keeping in mind. Now, I'm sure that you've all heard about microplastics being in the world's oceans, right? So we've known since 1972 that there was plastic floating around in the oceans. It shouldn't have been there. A lot of the early attention was on the gyres, such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But it's now understood that microplastics are present throughout the ocean, from the equator to both poles, and that they're present not only on the surface, but right down into the deep ocean. In the ocean, they do cause a lot of problems. So they are eaten by marine organisms, which can cause blockages, or lacerations, other harm, and disrupt their feeding behaviour, which has implications for photosynthesis and all up the food chain, including accumulation of plastic in food that we might eat. So back in 2015, there was a paper that came out where they had worked out that there were between 15 and 51 trillion microplastic particles floating at the Earth's surface. So by this stage, we knew quite a lot about microplastics in the ocean and where they were. But this was actually the year that microplastics were first reported in air. So this was a study that actually took place, this time 7 years ago. So it was Paris, and it was springtime, the flowers are blooming. And a study was carried out over 3 months where they put out what's called a deposition collector. So that's pretty much a stainless steel funnel over a bottle. It's housed in this wooden container shown. And they just collected whatever fell out into that funnel and looked at it under a microscope. And they found a whole lot of synthetic fibers and other fragments of plastic. That then led to some subsequent studies, one in Tehran, published in 2017, where they collected the road dust, swept it up from central Tehran following a 2-month dry spell. They also identified microplastics in this dry dust, which implies that microplastics may have fallen out of the atmosphere onto the road, and that was what was then seen in the lab. There was another study published in 2017, this time in Dongguan in China, where they collected atmospheric fallout. Again, they identified microplastics in all of their samples, and most commonly polyethylene, polypropylene, and polystyrene. So this was the point where I came to this field. It was 2018, it was my first year of lecturing, and I was writing a lecture on atmospheric composition and compiling a slide of, well, we've got this much sea spray in the atmosphere and this much soot and whatever else is in there. And this thought just suddenly struck me of, I wonder if there's plastic. And so I did some literature searching and I came across these papers, and it was something that really captured my attention. I put aside my lecture, I went back to writing that another time, but I really wanted to learn what this plastic was doing in the atmosphere, and very quickly came to the conclusion that there was not much known, which meant that there was an awful lot that we still had to learn. What I really wanted to be able to do was, because I'm a climate modeler, that's my background, I wanted to be able to put microplastics into a climate model and look at what they're doing to climate change. But with only 3 studies published, there was quite a substantial body of work that was going to need to be undertaken before we could get to that point. So at this point, I go and see my colleague Sally Gore, who's actually sitting up here, who had studied microplastics in rivers. And I said, Sally, do you think there would be microplastics in New Zealand? And could we measure them? And she stared at me for a very long time, so long that I was about to apologize for wasting her time and leave. And then she said, yes, I think they're there, and yes, we can measure them. And so that was what kicked off this journey that we've been on the last few years. The initial year or so was spent getting funding, which I was successful in getting from, first of all, from a University of Canterbury research seeding grant, and then from the Marsden Fund. And that has enabled us to carry out all of the work that I will be presenting this evening. Okay, but one of the questions we had at this point, 3 studies, right? Paris, Dongguan, and Tehran. These are all megacities with millions of residents. Does it imply that we only have airborne microplastics in megacities? And it turns out the answer is no. So in 2019, a very high-profile paper came out in Nature Geoscience, led by Steve and Dione Ellen. They had been working up in the French Pyrenees and collecting atmospheric fallout, and they found all of these microplastics in their samples over a 5-month period. This was really the first evidence of long-range transport through the atmosphere, that they could travel over thousands of kilometres. And furthermore, the fluxes of microplastics that they recorded were reasonably similar to the early studies in Paris, indicating that this is really not just an issue that's confined to megacities. Another paper came out in 2019 confirming this, where they had sampled snow that was collected in the European Alps, in some cities in Germany, and up in the remote Arctic. And again, they found microplastics in all their samples, rather fewer in the Arctic compared with what was collected in populated areas of Europe. But this still tells us that microplastics are everywhere, and that the atmosphere is transporting them to remote regions. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at this, because in general the atmosphere is very dynamic and it is a very fast way to transport things around, much faster than the oceans. So years ago I worked in Switzerland, and I knew that there were times when we'd sometimes see the snow turning orange. That is shown here in a webcam up at 1,600 meters. What's happening here is that Saharan dust gets transported up, shown here by satellite image, up from the desert and gets deposited up in Europe. So we do know, right, that the atmosphere transports particulate matter over very large distances. And when we look at the densities of these compounds, mineral dust has a density of 2.5 grams per cubic centimetre, whereas the densities of typical plastics that we see in the environment are much lower. So these microplastics are very small, they're very lightweight, they're lower density than something like mineral dust, which is easily transported. And so these really can be transported over very large distances indeed. Right, the last study I'll talk about, because there have been many, many studies on airborne microplastics just in the last couple of years, but this is a significant study that came out in Science in 2020. Janice Brainey was actually studying studying mineral dust in remote conservation areas in the United States. And when she began looking at her samples, she was finding chunks of plastic in all of them, which turned into this study, Plastic Rain in Protected Areas of the United States, and has been a very significant contribution. So this is some recent work that we've led. It's recently been accepted for publication in the cryosphere. Back in 2019, shortly before the pandemic hit, I had a student, Alex Aves, travel down to Antarctica as part of the University of Canterbury's postgraduate certificate in Antarctic studies. It was a program that includes a field trip to Antarctica. And I was offered the chance to run a project, and I thought it would be interesting to collect snow in Antarctica and, similar to the study in the Arctic, look and see if we could find any microplastics, because no one had looked for microplastics in Antarctic snow before, or for any evidence of atmospheric deposition there. And so Alex went down, and we told her to take samples from all of the remote sites that were visited on the trip, marked here by the black circles. Here, these blue triangles are the research stations, so that's Scott Base and McMurdo Station. And we told her to take some samples from the base, around the bases, including on the roadway outside McMurdo Station, because we were quite, I guess, optimistic that we wouldn't find any microplastics in fresh snowfall that would have been, that we collected at these very remote locations. So, yeah, forget about the roadway sample. It turned out that was far too dirty to analyse properly, but all of these remote sites did actually have microplastics in them, which was quite shocking when we first realised this. So the size of the circle here indicates the concentration that we had, so up to 82 microplastics per litre of melted snow, and on average 29 microplastics per litre. So this was comparable with results that we were seeing in the Arctic. And Alex identified 13 different types of plastic, of which the most common was PET, which is used in making drink bottles and clothing and other. It's a very common plastic. So what we spent a lot of time thinking about is, where have they come from? So one idea is that they've been transported over really long distances, like thousands of kilometres through the atmosphere. Or it's possible that they were in the ocean and got emitted into the atmosphere when at high wind speeds, when waves break and bubbles burst. We think plastics can get into the atmosphere that way. Or it could be that they were just coming from the local scientific activities at the research stations down there. Remember, this was fresh snowfall, though. It had snowed literally hours before Alex collected these samples. So we did some modelling to look at the idea of long-range transport, and so we did what's called some backward modelling, where you look at a parcel of air, and then with a model, using the meteorology from the weather that's happened, you can run that model back in time and trace where that parcel of air has come from. And so all of the trajectories that we have here are coming off the ocean. This is assuming a 6-day residence time for microplastics in the atmosphere. And the orange circles shown on this map are other scientific bases around Antarctica. So there's no obvious source that they've been picked up from nearby another base and transported over. But I mean, they still could have been in the ocean and emitted into the atmosphere and then travelled to the sampling sites that way. But what was interesting is that most of the plastics that we found were pink and blue and green. And so it does sort of lead us to suspect that also because a lot of the particles we found were fibres, and they were quite large, several hundreds of micrometers long, that they could have come from the marker flags that are put out for wayfinding out in the field. So these start off red and green, and then after some time out in the field, they become very frayed and have changed colour. So that could also be another explanation, but this does tell us about that. Certainly Antarctica is not immune from the human presence down there, and that we do have a microplastic footprint down in Antarctica. We have also done work here at the University of Canterbury looking for airborne microplastics, and I think this is still the only published report of airborne microplastics in New Zealand. This was, we had a summer student, Ellen Knobloch, who was going to do this and see just could we find microplastics in air in New Zealand. We tested some various different types of gear to set this experiment up, which is what is shown here. We tried out putting a glass funnel over a glass bottle. We had a Petri dish covered in double-sided sticky tape, which was impossible to work with. It's very hard to move tiny particles from double-sided sticky tape in hindsight. We tried an open glass beaker, and then this thing here is installed on the engineering rooftop. It's an automatic wet deposition collector. So whenever it detects a couple of drops of rain, the lid slides off, and we can collect whatever comes out with the rain, and then the lid slides closed again. This also turned out to be useless because we had an unprecedented dry spell when we did our week of sampling. We then repeated the experiment later in the year, and it also did not rain then either. So weather is not something we can do too much about. But both of our open glass beaker and the funnel over the bottle were very effective at collecting microplastics. Neither was particularly better than the other. And the fluxes that we found were between 19 to 47 particles per metre squared per day. I've compared here some of the earlier studies that I've shown. So our fluxes are at the smaller end. This could be especially compared with somewhere like Dongguan or Paris. You know, Christchurch is a smaller city, less densely populated. And it could also be down to our methods of identifying microplastics. Some of the earlier studies used a method called visual counting, which I'm going to show you a bit in a minute. We were very rigorous and insisted that every single particle was identified using the equipment in our lab and confirmed as plastic. So that could also be a reason why there's a lower. And in general, this is really something that is an issue when you're working in an emerging field, is that there is no standardized way of doing things, and that is really something that we want to get for airborne microplastic studies, is to agree on a method so that everyone can use this and that our results are more comparable. Right, so here are some particles that we found. We have a polyester fibre. We have an epoxy resin fragment, just to give you an idea of size. This is 100 micrometers across, so that's about the width of a human hair. And an acrylic fibre and a polyethylene film. So how do we know what type of plastic this is? We'll get to that. So this visual identification of microplastics is a technique that comes, I guess, from the days when it's more from the marine microplastic studies that were done in the 90s and 2000s. And it's this idea that plastic has very specific characteristics which can be identified by looking at it under a microscope. So what's shown here in this figure are a whole lot of natural fibres, coarse wool, cashmere, cotton, and these tend to have quite a twisted appearance or with ridges on them, whereas the polyester fibre here is notable because it has very smooth edges and a consistent thickness. And in addition, microplastics can have very bright colours. They don't always. We do see lots of black ones in our studies. And natural particles can have bright colours too, but that's another way that we might identify them. So is this any good? We're going to put this to the test now. Can you please take out your phones, open your internet browser, and type in kahoot.it. And if you are joining us on the live stream, then you can also do this and join us for some citizen science in real time. Okay. So that's kahoot.it. Hopefully that is good. We'll bring this up. Right. It'll ask you for a PIN, and that PIN is 7184465. Alrighty, I'm going to start this. So kahoot.it 7184465. You can still join even after I start the quiz. Alrighty, let's get underway. Okay, so this first question is just so you get used to how to do a Kahoot, if you haven't done one before. The day today is Wednesday, by the way, if anyone needs a reminder. So on your phone, you'll see the options. Wednesday is that orangey brown one. Press that one. And we have 6 seconds left, and hopefully everyone's managed to get an answer in. Okay, good. Everyone got the day right. Congratulations. You all pass. Right, so here's our criteria for visually identifying microplastics. So they have a smooth edge and consistent thickness, whereas natural fibers often have this twisted appearance and a variable thickness, and microplastics can be brightly colored. So let's see if you can spot the microplastics. Right, so which of these, in the image that comes up, is a microplastic? So most people got that. Yeah, it was a fiber on the left. I did tell you that microplastics have a consistent thickness and are very smooth, and that fiber did not. It's going to show me a picture of it again. So this is an up-close image of it. It does have some ridging. Microplastics do pick up stuff in the environment, and they can also, they're carrying coatings around. So this criteria is far from perfect, as we're going to see. All right, see if you can figure out in this image how many microplastics there are. Options are none, 2, 3, or 5. Okay, well done. Yes, there are two. So they are the two blue fibres. There we are. Those are both, polyester. All right, two more to go. Do you think this one is a microplastic? It is brightly coloured. It is not. It's cotton, it turns out. So, yeah. Colour cannot be used as a reliable proxy. Right, that's cotton right there. And last one. Yeah, so that was really tricky. Neither of them are microplastics. So these are both natural particles. They're algal fibres in the middle here. So well done if you got them all right, and come and see me because I'm going to give you a job in my lab. But as we've seen, it's really hard to use visual identification to figure out which ones are microplastics. So it's very subjective. There are loads of exceptions to the rules, and because the environmental samples are almost always degraded, it's just really hard to use this criteria. And so in our sampling, we use spectroscopic identification, which means that we're using, in our case, we use Fourier transform infrared spectrometry, which gives us a characteristic signal for the particle, which I've shown here for a couple of our plastics that we collected here in Christchurch, and then we can match that against our reference library of spectra to figure out the composition. All right, so moving back out from like the microscale into the bigger picture, this paper came out last week. I'm a co-author on this together with 32 others. It was an effort that the World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environmental Programme supported us to write this paper on what is known about the atmosphere as a source of microplastics to the ocean. And so from synthesizing all of the available studies to date, we estimate that up to 25 million metric tons of microplastics are in the atmosphere over the world's oceans. And given the harm that they can cause to the marine environment, this is potentially very problematic. 25 million metric tons is a really big number, and I'm aware that it's quite hard to get an idea for what that actually means. So to put that in perspective, if you assume that an Asian elephant grows to 4,000 kilograms, then it's over 6 million Asian elephants worth of plastic, equivalent mass. 6 million elephants is still quite a lot. So if you lined up all of the elephants in a row, then you would get a line of elephants stretching from the equator all around and back to where you started again. So that's potentially a lot of plastic in the atmosphere. This is an upper limit though, and I hope that it is not that much, but unfortunately the abundance of plastic in the environment is expected to grow over time given current trends. So given that we have plastic, it's widespread in the atmosphere, it's traveling around with the winds, I think we can really think of this as another type of atmospheric aerosol. So, and this is just a little animation of typical aerosols we see in the atmosphere. It comes from a climate model, and they've coloured the different types of aerosols to show the movement patterns. But we get lots of sea spray over the oceans. We get like biomass burning and biogenic aerosols, those are in green. We have all of our Saharan dust that can be transported and deposited all sorts of places, including the Swiss Alps, as I showed. And the white stuff is sulfates, which comes from industrial activity mostly. So let's have a little think about what we know about aerosols in the atmosphere. I'm going to pause that because it's very hypnotizing. So aerosols are a type of short-lived climate forcer. As this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change group them as. They have atmospheric lifetimes on the order of days to months or years. I mean, so methane, for example, is considered a short-lived climate forcer, and it has an atmospheric lifetime of about 10 years. Aerosols have much shorter lifetimes. And how they impact climate is they can scatter light, so it's like having a whole lot of disco balls up in the atmosphere scattering sunlight back out to space. They can absorb radiation emitted by the Earth and so trap heat in the lower atmosphere. They can also absorb radiation from the sun, some of them. And so this leads to sort of local changes in temperature and rainfall and weather patterns. So if we have a look at the contribution to climate change from greenhouse gases and aerosols, this again comes from the most recent IPCC Working Group 1 report that came out just last year. Here we have carbon dioxide. This is our biggest one. It has a large positive radiative forcing. It heats the climate. So does methane. Coming down, here we have sulfur dioxide, which forms sulfate aerosol. We have organic carbon aerosol. Both of these have a negative radiative forcing, which means that overall they counteract the effects of greenhouse gases. Black carbon is an exception because it absorbs sunlight, because it's black, it's highly absorbing of sunlight, so that leads to warming. But overall, in general, aerosols lead to cooling of the atmosphere, so over in time, as more cities want to improve their air quality, this is going to have this effect that we amplify greenhouse warming even further by reducing the aerosols. But of course, there's no reason why we shouldn't have cities with healthy air to breathe. So the question I had was, what effect do airborne microplastics have? So how do they interact with light? Are they absorbing sunlight? Are they scattering it? How abundant are they? We've seen a bit of that from what I've shown. And then the third thing I really wanted to do was put this information into a global climate model and calculate the impacts of airborne microplastics on climate. So the question of how they interact with light, this work was led by Eric LaRue, a collaborator at Victoria University of Wellington. What we're really thinking about is, so in the Earth's atmosphere, we have this radiation that comes from the sun. This is our ultraviolet and visible radiation. And then we have the radiation that's emitted by the Earth. So this is in the form of infrared radiation. And we looked at microplastic fragments and fibers, which are by far the two most common shapes that we see out in the environment, to calculate those optical properties, which tell us about how microplastics behave when they interact with light. We then thought about how abundant are microplastics. We looked at the sorts of measurements available. We have two types of studies usually. There's deposition studies of the sort we did here on the engineering rooftop. And then there's the air filter studies, such as this setup here, which was, this photo was taken at Kaitoreti Spit out at Birdlings Flat. And so we did a sort of a trial sampling campaign there last year using an air filter. So we have a pump and we're pumping air through this filter. So we get the number of particles per cubic meter of air. This is the more useful bit of information to put into our model. Unfortunately, when we did this, there hadn't been too many studies worldwide reporting on the concentration of microplastics in air using air filter studies. So we're drawing on a fairly limited number of studies, but the results are highly variable, spanning 5 orders of magnitude. And some of this will be down to the methods used. Some studies can detect smaller particles than others. And some of these will be down to just biases and different people doing their studies differently. There's no standardized method yet. And some will be genuinely down to geography, in that you do see more microplastics in central London compared with over the West Pacific Ocean. So we took the average concentration, which is about 100 microplastics per cubic meter, and put this into our model. And so here we have this is our first ever global climate model simulations with airborne microplastics. We use the New Zealand Earth System model. This runs on the New Zealand eScience infrastructure, so high performance compute cluster, which is up in Wellington. So here are the machines here. These are really expensive models to run, so to do about a 20-year simulation takes a couple of weeks of just compute time. But then we got the results, and so I'll show you what we found. So it turns out that airborne microplastics have 2 effects. They both heat and cool the atmosphere. So the cooling comes because they are like those little disco balls in the atmosphere, and they're scattering light back out to space. We did assume that all of the plastics we put into our model had no colour, simply because there was no available information for coloured plastics to put into the model. But that is work in progress, and it could be that, given we know there are lots of dark coloured microplastics out in the environment, it could be that actually they're absorbing sunlight instead of scattering it. There's a lot of uncertainties here, but this is the state of the science. It's still very new. So they have that cooling influence, and then they also heat the atmosphere by behaving like greenhouse gases and trapping the infrared radiation that's emitted by the Earth. And the balance of which is more dominant depends on numerous things, so such as the colour, which we couldn't account for, but also stuff like how high up in the atmosphere they are, which is also a big unknown at this stage. But if we compare with other types of atmospheric aerosols that are considered by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so these are shown here in these light grey bars, we see that microplastics have a very small climate impact at this stage. It's a small negative forcing, which means that overall it would be a cooling influence, but subject to all of those uncertainties that I've talked about. And it could be that overall the impact is warming, but we need more studies to inform our modelling. We do expect that the climate forcing that airborne microplastics have is going to grow in future, because there is so much plastic out there in the environment that is breaking down to form new microplastics, and those at some point will likely get lofted into the atmosphere. We also need to know more about nanoplastics. Nanoparticles are very important in terms of atmospheric science and forming clouds and absorbing and scattering light, but we know very little about them to date, other than that the early indications are that they are there. So this work comes from a collaborator, Dusan Materik, who works in the Netherlands. He has collected snow at Sonnenblick Observatory up in Austria and found billions of nanoplastics, so smaller than 1 micrometer, being deposited per square meter of surface snow each week. And so this is important in the context of climate science, because we want to know how much plastic is out there, but also in terms of human health, because particles that are smaller than 10 micrometers are easily inhaled. And the smaller they are, the further they can get into your body tissues. There have been some pretty big studies coming out recently talking about implications of microplastics for human health. So they have been recently found in human blood for the first time, and deep in the lungs of living people. So these were from patients who were undergoing surgery. There was a study published last year looking at what happens when you expose human lung tissues or cells to microplastics. They expose them to polystyrene, and they found that this slows the rate of cell growth and reproduction, and it also changed the exposure to the plastics also changed the shape of the cells. So their conclusion was that human exposure to microplastic pollution has significant consequence and potential harm to humans. Now, in the context of where are we vulnerable to microplastic exposure, to inhaling it, it's probably less outdoors than it is indoors, right? So we spend most of our time indoors, and we do know that there are microplastics indoors. Sorry to say that while you're all sitting inside at the moment. This is a study we did last year. It turned out being during the COVID-19 lockdown. Our student Amelia Livingstone had planned to do this on University of Canterbury campus, an indoor study. We got sent into lockdown, so we ended up doing it at home. We had 4 households put out deposition collectors in their living areas and bedrooms, and Amelia looked at what was in each sample after we'd left them out for a week. So this is a very preliminary study. We haven't done the full spectroscopic analysis on all of these samples, simply because we found so many fibres. They hundreds of fibres, per metre squared per day, so that these are very time-consuming to look at. But the early indications are that of these fluxes shown here, about 20 to 30% of these are microplastics. So, given that people spend their time indoors, this is likely where the issues with exposure are going to happen. All right, so where to next? I'm doing all right for time. So, as of 2015, there were about 5 gigatons of plastic waste accumulated in landfills or the natural environment. This is projected to, I think, double in the next 3 decades in the absence of serious changes to policies surrounding plastic production and waste management. The good news is that as of March 2022, there's been multilateral agreement between about 200 countries through the United Nations Environment Assembly to develop an international legally binding plastic pollution treaty. So the draft is expected at the end of 2024, and this will assess all stages of plastic, so it's including production and waste management. And it will be legally binding, which is good news. But in the meantime, there's still all of this plastic out there. It will be forming new microplastics, and so we still have a lot to do to understand what microplastics are doing in terms of other climate and atmospheric processes, and we need to learn more also about what they're doing to human and ecosystem health. So there's much more that we don't know than we do still, but I hope this has shed some light on what we know so far. And with that, I'll come to my acknowledgements. So I really want to thank colleagues at the University of Canterbury I've been working with, so Sally Gore, also Michelle LaRue and Adrian McDonald, who's involved with Gateway Antarctica and has meant that we've been able to collect samples down there for the past 3 summer seasons. Eric LaRue at Victoria University of Wellington, who's done our optical property calculations. Olga Pantos at ESR, who let us use her FTIR before our one was up and running. And the Marsden Fund for their support of this research. But finally, and absolutely not least of all, I really want to thank all of the students and postdocs that are listed here who've actually been doing the hard yards on this over recent years and whom it's been an absolute pleasure to work with. So, with that, I will move into question times, and the instruction I have is so if you can ask your questions, I will then repeat it for the purposes of the live stream, and the instruction I think is to please make sure that your first sentence is a question and that there is no second sentence. So thank you very much. Apparently we can't pass the mic around, so people will just have to put their hand up and shout. Hello.
Hi, I just wondered whether you had any results about the age of the plastics that you found.
No, we don't. That is, I know that, so I should repeat the question. Do we have information about the age of the plastics? I know that this is something that other groups have looked at, and there will be literature out there on it because they do tend to be quite aged in the environment, and that can be studied by looking at various signatures in the molecule. Yeah, they are, unfortunately, they can be quite brittle when we look at them, so which tells us, and fall apart easily, so that can tell us that it's another sign of aging. But yeah, it's not something that we have looked at and have data on at this stage. Thank you. Up the back.
Do you know if the plastic starts as microplastic, becomes nano?
Yes.
Presumably gets smaller and smaller.
Yes.
Is there a point at which it breaks down chemically?
Yes, it does. So the question for the live stream was, so microplastics forms nanoplastics and it breaks down. Is there a point where it's completely broken down? Yes, so it breaks down to form methane and ethylene, so greenhouse gases. Yeah. That's the end point, but that could take a very long time. Yeah. Up the back there. Yes. So, okay. Yes, so the question of there will be policies coming through on plastics. Does it include manufacturers? As well as public bodies? So I will hands up say I don't know the ins and outs of the treaty, but my assumption is that it will be that governments will be regulated, and that governments will then have to pass those policy changes on to any activities happening in their countries. So they'll have to put those controls on plastic production, is my assumption, and I very much hope that that comes to pass. Yeah, thank you. We just had one up here first, and then I'll, yes.
I was wondering whether there was any thoughts to perhaps studying microplastic prevalence in the agricultural animals, like testing in urine or something like that?
And any studies on agricultural animals? The answer is I don't know. I don't know if anyone is doing that. It's possible, but it would be interesting because I know that plastics in agriculture are a big thing, like it's in the mulch that gets spread, and so this is, again, a source to the atmosphere. And yeah, is it in the animal meat itself? It's probably in the animals themselves. Sorry, I just don't know if anyone has actually studied that. But, yeah. Yeah, definitely interesting. Yeah, I think there was one from the live stream.
So this is from the live stream. The question is there a reason why you count the number of particles rather than the overall mass?
Yes, so why do we count the number of particles rather than the mass? Ideally, we want to do both. So for a lot of fields, they want to know the mass of the plastic in thinking about exposure studies. And for me, as an atmospheric scientist, I really want the particle number because I want to know the size distribution, so how many particles are of different size groups, because that tells me about how about different behaviour, how they're going to behave when they're of different size classes. So some methods will automatically detect mass, and some characterise the number. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here.
Have there been any studies for whether the plastics in the ocean is affecting the temperature of the ocean, or whether it's reflecting light?
Do plastics in the ocean change the temperature of the ocean? I'm not aware of any studies. I mean, it would be possibly if there are dark-coloured plastics floating on the surface and then they're absorbing sunlight, that might lead to localised changes in temperature. It's entirely possible. I just don't know if anyone has looked at that. Sorry. Yeah, it's such a big field. I feel that there's so much yet more to learn, and it's possible that people are doing this, and I just don't know. Yes.
The nanoplastics and microplastics in the human body, do we know if it's coming mainly from the air we breathe, the food we eat, like fish, animal products, or from the water we drink, or another source?
Yeah, the nanoplastics, how are they getting into the body? So through what we're eating or what we're breathing in? There used to be a lot of concern about seafood, and that if there are plastics in the fish, then you're going to eat them. The latest that I heard was that you actually get more from just the plastics falling out of the air onto your food, rather than from what's in the food itself. That's the current thinking. Microplastics are quite abundant indoors. Okay, we have a whole lot of hands up here. I'll start.
You mentioned reflection and absorption.
Yes.
Was there any work done on cloud seeding and rainfall from microplastics?
There has not yet been that work done. I'm going to repeat the question. Has there been work done on the ability of microplastics to seed cloud formation and affect rainfall? This is something I really want to work on. It's like next on my list. And we do know that atmospheric aerosols do seed cloud formation. This changes the lifetime of the cloud. That can potentially have a very big influence on climate, and it is something that we do need to be studying. Yeah, thank you. Yes, just behind.
In the data collection in the house, I noticed that you had about 400, and it was less and then more and more and more.
Yeah.
Do you know what the difference? What made it one house having more?
Yeah, why did the houses have different amounts? So this was one student project done during lockdown, so we weren't controlling heavily for things like the number of occupants. The one outlier was there was one house that had had about double the number of particles compared with the average, and that house, this could be a coincidence, but that house did not have carpet. And, but what did lead us to speculate, well, is the carpet actually trapping the plastics rather than letting them be suspended throughout the air? But again, this was just a very small sample size, and we would need to do a much bigger.
So the outliner did not have carpet?
It did not have carpet, yeah. Which is, again, is completely the opposite of what I would have thought. I would have thought that the carpets would be a big source of plastics, but it's possible that they just are really good at trapping the stuff closer to the ground. We'd need to do a much bigger study to know for sure. All right, yes.
We did know about PM10s and
Yeah.
particle releases of diesel exhausts. Is there a reasonable assumption that these sub-10 micrometer particles that we're finding will also have the mass and carcinogenic properties that diesel fumes have?
Sorry, I think I did. Can you just restate the question, please? So PM10 and from diesel, and
that is known to have carcinogenic effects
yes,
on us.
yes.
Would it be reasonable that the sub-10 sized particles that you're finding can also have carcinogenic effects?
Yeah, so do the particles smaller than 10 microns have carcinogenic effects? Yeah, it is possible. In the case of diesel fumes, that'll be from substances that are burned from combustion. But certainly the fact that they're smaller than 10 microns, they can get right inside the lungs and lead to all sorts of health problems. And it's possible that cancers would be one of those. The studies will be coming out over the next few years and tell us more. Yeah. Sorry.
Since nanoplastics can break down into greenhouse gases,
Yes.
is there much harm in burning plastics and using Iceland's greenhouse capture technology to store it in the ground as well?
So could you burn nanoplastics and store it in the ground? I mean, I guess you could. It would be presumably quite energy intensive to do that. Right, I see you're thinking of it as in trying to get rid of the plastic. I think the problem would be with collecting it from the environment, because that's also would be incredibly energy intensive to try and filter it.
Regarding the landfills we have at the moment,
Could you just burn it all and capture it? It would have to be done in a very in a very controlled way. You would not want to release those plumes at all into the atmosphere.
Iceland has technology that takes a lot of the gases that they produce in their geothermal heat production, and then they store it as rock in the ground as excess gases.
Okay, that's interesting to hear. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Through doing this research, has your behavior changed, and if so, how?
So has my behaviour changed through this research, and if so, how? I get much more irritated now when I see needless uses of plastics. Things like sequins on clothes, or single-use, the toys that McDonald's give away. It irritated me to no end when I just see these useless lumps of plastic. I also pay much attention when I'm in the shops and not noticing what the clothes are made of, because so many are synthetics. Yeah, it is really something I think about more is, how do we get rid of them from our lifestyles? Because they're everywhere, they're almost impossible to avoid, and some of them are really useful. For example, used in medicine, when they're packaging medicines, that seems like a really good use, but then there are so many pointless uses. That this is something I really wish that people would be more aware of their behaviour, and it seems like a no-brainer just to chase after the really easy stuff that you don't actually need, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Yeah. Hi.
Are there any industrial emissions which are implicated in pouring out microplastics and nanoplastics?
So are there industrial process emissions that are associated with microplastics? I mean, Yeah, like the transport industry, I guess, all of that road dust that's generated produces, when synthetic tyres drive, or private cars as well, that generates microplastics. So from the breakwear particles, the road tyre dust. So that's not really pumping them into the atmosphere, which I think might have been what you were getting at. But I guess like every industry is generating some form of microplastics in some way. They're really ubiquitous. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, time for one, maybe 2 questions and push.
Okay.
Are you optimistic for the future?
Am I optimistic for the future? Yeah, tentatively, yes. I mean, I think this plastic pollution treaty that's coming in is really welcome news. I think a lot about climate change as well in my line of work, but I've seen how things like the Montreal Protocol for substances that deplete ozone has really turned the ozone problem around, and I could probably give a whole separate talk on why the Montreal Protocol is different to the climate change issue. But I don't wake up every day and think, oh no, this is all terrible, all of these pollution problems, because they're these are headaches that we have to deal with. I'm talking more broadly about climate problems as well, that we will have to deal with, but there are enough people around who recognise the need to change our behaviour, and it is possible to make big changes. I mean, the New Zealand government's plastic bag ban was just so simple, right? And yet it's been so effective. You don't see plastic bags anymore, and we need more changes like that. And it can be done when citizens and governments are on board with those. One more, okay.
Is it biodegradable?
Oh. I'm so glad you asked. So they come in 2 forms, these bioplastics. There's a bioplastic which is made out of plants usually. Those are problematic because they are grown in monocultures, with a lot of pesticides applied, so that's bad for the environment. Plus you lose out on all the biodiversity from focusing on growing a single plant species. And then there are the biodegradable ones, which are usually not biodegradable in the sorts of landfills that we actually have in the real world. They might be biodegradable if you put them in a landfill for at a high enough temperature and pressure for 10 weeks, but typically, I don't know what we do, but in Christchurch, but typically councils are not able to treat their waste for that long, so things that are marketed as being biodegradable won't actually break down when composted. Yeah, so it's unfortunately there's no silver bullet.
Thank you very much. I'll use the chair's prerogative and ask you a question.
Okay.
Has anyone done any studies with cell proliferation using natural fibers?
With what?
Cell proliferation.
Using natural fibers.
Well, because obviously you put synthetic fibers in there.
Yeah.
What happens if you put natural fibers? Do you still see the same decrease in proliferation?
Well, so there's something called cotton lung, which is something that people who worked in factories in the garment industry would suffer from, like some respiratory illness associated with breathing in the cotton fibers. They've probably looked at it. Yeah, and switching simply from synthetics to natural clothing as well isn't an easy switch, because the problems with the microplastics are that they are so long-lived and they have all of these additives in them which are toxic. Whereas with a natural fibre, if it's being used for clothing, then they want to make it really hard wearing so they can put stuff in it that is also toxic, and it's also going to make it extremely durable. So again, no simple silver bullet.
Right, so we've got a bit of work to do. So
Yeah.
on that note, please join me in thanking Laura for a very thoughtful Again, thank you very much for coming over. Really appreciate your taking the evening of your day. And also, we'll make sure we'll let you know when we're testing, when we're sampling, because obviously we're guaranteed to be a day in our range. So just let us know. We'll make sure you're not